Hey all, Rodge here, aka the Wisco Horn Dog, back again for another Saga Thursday, your weekly Saga fix. Today is part 3 of our look at the Saga rules. So this part isn't really for newbies anymore, I would say. And if you were just learning Saga, at this point I would say probably get a couple games in and then go ahead and kind of circle back around to this video here as we take a look at the weapons, some kind of advanced movement techniques and tricks for keeping your enemies pinned in, and then just a few odds and ends with the terrain and stuff like that. So let's get into it. There are a few different weapons in Saga, and I'm sure there are quite a few people at home watching those original tutorial videos saying, the Anglo-Dane's got a Dane axe! He's got a Dane axe! So yeah, for close combat weapons, swords, spears, and stuff are pretty much the same, but there are, in the original rules, these Dane axes, which is a massive two-handed axe, and in Crescent and Cross, they call them heavy weapons. But a heavy weapon, Dane axe, whatever, you can, it'll describe in your army list whether you can take guys with a Dane axe or not. So if you take a Dane axe, you get a +1 to basically hit the enemy because of your massive axe. And then as a penalty though, your enemy gets a +1 to hit you because you are not using your shield when you're using your Dane axe. So against shooting, there's no penalty, but in close combat, basically, you're taking them down and you're also taking yourself down. So it just makes combats a little deadlier. I'm not a super big fan of them, but sometimes you're required to take them. Like the Anglo-Dane warlord has to take the Dane axe, so he's kind of forced into this killy role. But other than that, there are a few different equipment options we can go over. There's javelins, as we kind of played out some shooting attacks with them. The range on a javelin is medium, and it has a special rule associated with it where at the end of a movement, you can throw a javelin for free. So I could move these guys up to a medium, and then I could actually shoot a medium distance on top of that for free. So that's pretty cool, and you can only do that at the end of their movement because there is a piece of equipment called a Composite Bow, which I don't have any of those models, but those would be like kind of Eastern steppe tribes and horse peoples, and it's similar to a javelin. It's still a medium range, which is pretty short, and you can actually shoot at the beginning or at the end. So if you had a steppe tribe warrior, he could move in, he could shoot, and then if you activate him again, he could shoot and then move out for some double damage action there. Where if you had a javelin guy, he could move in, he could shoot. If you moved him out again, he can only shoot at the end, so he wouldn't be able to shoot again. So that's the key difference there. There's bows and slings, which are usually what Levy have. That would be basically a long 12-inch range. And there are crossbows, especially in Crescent and Cross, although the Normans can get them. And the crossbow is kind of like the equivalent of the Dane axe, where it gives you a +1 to hit. And it's the same penalty as well, except you get it all the time against shooting, I'm pretty sure as well. If you have a crossbow, you get a +1 to hit with your shooting, but it lowers your armor against everything by 1. So it makes you kind of weaker, but you can really deal out some damage. Like you're wounding Hearthguard on 4s with a crossbow. That's pretty gnarly. So the range on a crossbow is the long as well. So one important piece of equipment, and I don't have any of these models yet, but I'm definitely going to get some, is the horse. So these are all foot sloggers. Now the kind of early Dark Ages warbands, a lot of them are foot sloggers, but there are mounted factions, and the rules for a horse are they're pretty good. The rules for taking them usually are you can take a unit of foot guys, or you could just mount them and you still get the same number of guys. So it's somewhat of a trade-off, but it's a pretty good trade-off in my opinion. So the benefit if you are on a horse is you get to move the 12 inches. So that is awesome. That is pretty much the main benefit. You can move twice as fast as everybody else on foot. Now there are a number of penalties. One of them is you can never claim a cover bonus for being in the forest, or if there's a wall or rocks or something like that. Mounted troops can never go into a building, which is sort of obvious. Mounted troops, they reduce their armor by 1 against shooting, which is pretty massive. So if you can work them in, it's always nice to have a shooting unit, because oftentimes the only drawback of cavalry is shooting. And if you don't have any shooting, they're basically getting all these benefits for free. Now the last one, which is a revision to the actual core rules between the Dark Ages and Crescent and Cross, is when cavalry goes into the woods, it's reduced to a short, like everybody else. That didn't change. But the difference is, at the end of that movement, they will take a fatigue. So they really have trouble going into the woods and taking people out. So that kind of does make it a pretty good equalizer. That wasn't in the original Dark Ages rules. But it does even things up pretty nicely. But overall, mounted troops are definitely decent. They're weak against shooting, but other than that, they're pretty solid. And, they fight just as well as regular guys. There are camels that you can get in Crescent and Cross. Not really going to get into those. The rules are similar for horses. They get a benefit against horses when they're fighting them, and they actually don't take that fatigue and when they go into the woods. There are probably some additional rules, but I've never played against camels, and if you're interested in camels, you should check them out. One last piece of kit is the war banner, which I don't have any guys here. There is a banner attached to Andrew's Warlord's base for kind of cosmetic purposes, but you could actually pop this chick off and have her on a actual base. And you can have basically a standard, kind of similar to the way you would have in like Warhammer games or games like that. And it's pretty cool. It's kind of interesting. So it has to be at least a 6-man Hearthguard unit in strength, or a 10-man warrior unit. So this warrior unit, you needed a couple more. They wouldn't be able to take a banner, but this unit of Hearthguard can have a banner right here. And the model that has the flag actually doesn't attack, so there's a little bit of a drawback to that, which is kind of interesting. So they don't fight, but they do give you a special activation you could do called Rally Around the Banner, which it counts as a rest activation, but it's not a rest activation. It's Rally Around the Banner. So if you have fatigue on you, you could basically rally around the banner to get rid of the fatigue. Now the trick is, Rally Around the Banner doesn't have to be your first activation of the turn, which is really nice. So if these dudes had a banner, they could go in, fight these guys, fight my warlord or something like that, take a bunch of fatigue, and as long as you had the saga dice, you could rally around the banner, basically remove fatigue at the end of your turn instead of the beginning. Because once you rally around the banner, you're done moving. You can't move or shoot after that. So it's not in the middle of your kind of stuff. You really need to use it towards the end. And then there's an additional benefit where if you just don't activate that unit that has the banner, you get a free, if they have a fatigue at the end of the turn, they can remove it for free. So if they don't get activated and they have a fatigue, you can get rid of one. So that's kind of nice depending on what you're doing. So a few different benefits there. So that's pretty cool. Now we're going to get into some advanced rules, maybe some things that we missed. One thing in Saga is you always round fractions up. So there's a couple tricky things you can do with your warriors and stuff like that. So if these guys were shooting, for example, with javelins, you get 2 2 attacks, or every 2 guys gives you 1 shooting attack. So if you have 8 guys, you actually have 4 attacks. You round up in Saga, so actually if you have 7 guys, you actually have 4 attacks as well. So if you're doing multiple units of warriors and they're shooters like that, you can actually kind of squeeze out a few extra shooting attacks by having odd size units instead of even. Now obviously once you get into combat and stuff, and some guys get killed, it's not a big deal, but if you're starting off fresh, that is something you can do, and that's something mentioned in the Step Tribes video, because 6 warriors shooting is just as powerful as 5 warriors shooting, and you're actually going for multiple units, so you could actually go for 5-man units instead of 6. You can store dice on your board in these boxes even though you can't use them. So I can't remember if I mentioned this or not, but basically this ability, for example, it requires 2 different rares. So most of the time you're not going to roll 2 rares, but if you do get a rare, you can put one on there and then you can kind of store it there. You can't use the ability, but you can store it there, and then in a following turn if you roll a rare, then you can put it on there and then you can activate it. Now when you're rolling your Saga dice, if you keep it on there, it does subtract from your overall total. So if you're normally going to generate 6, you would only generate 5 if you had one saved on there. So boosh, look at that, got that friggin' rare, yeah baby, that's the way to do it. So that is something to consider. Now there's a couple tricky things with movement, in that if you start within very short of somebody at the start of your turn, you have to go into combat with them. If you start within multiple units, you have to go into at least one of them if you activate. So normally you can't move within very short of somebody unless you're going into combat. So you might be thinking to yourself, when does this come up? And it's actually fairly easy to do if your opponent isn't careful, and you can actually pin units this way. And when it comes into play is when we have 2 units side by side here. So I could activate my warriors here, go in. Because I'm going into combat and I'm hitting these guys first, I'm actually allowed to go within very short of these guys here. So I can move in, I can fight, and then as long as I win combat, so I don't fall back, I can, if I win combat, these guys will fall back and I will stay there, and then these guys are basically pinned now. If they activate on his turn, they have to go into my Hearthguard, which is pretty, could be good, could be bad, depending on how you plan it out, but that's something you know that has to happen according to the rules. You can kind of set up these kind of counter engagements by pinning these units in place here. Now one thing I don't think I mentioned is when you're doing your second movement activation, there's an additional kind of a qualification where you can't, it makes it difficult to kind of move around guys. So let's say I'm doing this, I'm moving these guys over here like this, because my intent is to go and sneak around and just kill their warlord in the back. Now the thing is, when you activate them for a second activation, normally if you're within very short, you have to go in. So I avoided that right there, but on the second activation it's actually within short, so it jumps up a distance. So I need to go around by a fairly big margin here in order to go around. So it sort of changes it from 2 activations to get to them to at least 3. And this is probably one of the few times you'd string out your guys if you thought that was something they were trying to do like that. Usually it makes you vulnerable. They can go in and a couple of your guys will be out of combat, but then it really pushes that, pushes that short distance very far out there. So that's one thing to consider when you are doing multiple activations. The other thing is you take the fatigue at the end when you do multiple activations. Let's say I activate these guys again. Go like that. you take the fatigue at the end of the movement, which is actually important because you can't actually use that fatigue then to slow them down, because you can use a fatigue to slow somebody's movement from a medium to a short. So if it's the second activation, that's actually, they don't have the fatigue yet, so they can't use it. Every once in a while that pops up. So it'd have to be the third activation. So look at this. The third one they could go in, but the Viking player could use that fatigue they generate on the second move when they're doing the third move and shorten it to just a short. And then if they did that, that's a multiple activation again, so they end up with a fatigue at the end of it as well. So that's kind of how multiple activations, movement, and those additional fatigues work out. Now the last thing to get into is terrain, and I think we did touch it on a little bit, but basically there's difficult ground, which most terrain is this, but you got to just have like this field, for example, count as difficult ground, and all that does is reduce the movement from a medium to a short. And as we discussed, that does affect cavalry and camels and stuff like that. The other thing that actual cover can provide, and there's two types. There's light cover, which is like woods, maybe like vineyards, stuff like that. And then there's hard cover, which is rocks and stuff like that. So light cover is probably the most common thing. And if you want to count the light cover bonus for being in the woods, you need at least 2/3 of your models to be within the woods here. So 2/3. So this is 5/8, which I put myself on the spot for math here, but I don't believe that that is actually 2/3. It's like 62% or something like that, and we need 66%. So you would need 6 of these 8 dudes into the woods in order to count light cover. And all light cover is against shooting only, so it doesn't work in close combat, is when you are taking your defense roll. Normally you defend on 4s against shooting. If you're in light cover, you defend on 3s. Wouldn't help in this particular situation, we can see. But just adds 1 to your armor. So actually taking dudes out in the woods is pretty tough. Every wound you do, every 3 wounds you do, 2 will bounce back for the defense save. So that's pretty gnarly. If we're going to say that this was hard cover, like it was piles of rocks and stuff like that, for shooting, it actually adds 1 to your armor at the beginning and then also 1 to your defense roll. So if we were shooting these Hearthguard, normally it'd be 5s to hit if you were just using javelins or bows or something like that. You would actually need 6s to hit because of the hard cover. And then if you did get a wound through, they would save on a 3 instead of a 4. So that is pretty gnarly. When you're in stone and stuff like that, you are doing good. Now, there is a benefit to hard cover that you don't get with light cover. So being in the woods doesn't affect you in close combat at all, but if you are in the woods and you are in hard cover, such as behind a wall or in the rocks there, if you are the defender, so that's the key thing. So both units can be in the hard cover. Like right here, see we have 2 of these guys are actually in the zone of the cover. It's the defender that has to be in the hard cover to get a bonus. You're kind of holing up in the rocks and stuff like that. If you're attacking, you're too busy charging the enemy in order to use the terrain effectively. So if you are in hard cover, the one benefit you get is on your defense dice, similar to light cover actually. Just in close combat, normally you'd save on 5s, and that goes to a 4. So that's pretty decent. If you can, the big thing there is if you can stack that and get a few other defense dice in other ways. For every 2 defense dice you have, statistically you should block 1 wound coming through. So you can, 4s are pretty dicey too. You can just roll a crap load of them. So you could go in, do 5 wounds to somebody if they have 2 extra defense dice and they're blocking on 4s. I didn't roll any 4s this time, but we saved 4 of those 5 just right there. So you can imagine it can be pretty tough to root these guys out of these rocky positions and stuff like that. And then let's say it was a draw, somebody bounced back. If they're both in the woods, or sorry, the hard cover, if the other guy charged, then the other guy would get the hard cover bonus. So whoever is charging doesn't get the bonus, only the defender. So that's kind of the key thing to keep in mind with your Saga abilities and stuff like that. So lastly, we have buildings. There are buildings rules. I don't see them used a lot. It's not really that difficult. Buildings count as hardcover, so everything we just discussed applies there. There are sizes. There's like a medium building can hold 8 guys. Big one can hold 12. And you can actually have multiple units in there. That's kind of the weird thing. I'm not sure why they did it that way, but this nice foreground house, you can actually pop the top off, put your guys in there. So to get into a building, you have to be, it kind of slows you down, you have to be within short. And I think actually everybody has to be within short, now that I think about it. Yes, so everybody needs to be able to move in with a short move on that turn. One thing is if you move into a building, you cannot move out that building that same turn. So you can't move in, do some shooting or whatever, and then pop out in the same turn. You can either go in or you can go out once per turn. So it does slow you down a bit. Once you're in a building, basically the footprint of the building, kind of like if you've ever played Warhammer, the last version of it, the footprint of the building counts as your unit then. So if guys are charging your building, they just need to be within whatever their move distance. They just have to touch it, and then basically it counts as a unit. If guys within very short count as attacking. Everybody in the building can fight. Now if you have multiple units, you actually declare which one is going to fight, and that is that. So like if you had your warlord in there, he's actually pretty safe, because if he's in there with a different unit, that unit, you just say, well, the unit's going to fight, the warlord's just going to stay there. So combat, okay, so this I'm looking at the rules right now because it's kind of tricky. So in order for these guys to actually get into the building, is they have to wipe out that whole unit. So basically in your building you never retreat. You have to actually kill every single dude, otherwise you're just going to keep bouncing off until they're all gone. So you can't actually get in there until everybody's dead. So if there are 2 units, you need to kill the first unit, and then once they're completely dead, then you go in again, then you can attack the other unit. But there is those model counts. So most of the time it'll just be a warlord or potentially a priest in there. Which, speaking of priests, I will be doing a separate priest video about those guys. There have been some changes from the published rules that we can go through. We can just talk about how they work in general, because you can get a warrior priest, a religious advisor priest, and then a enlightened, like a monk type dude who's been hermit, cast away, and holed up for a long time. And they count as 1 point, and basically you could either take 8 warriors or a priest. You could take 4 Hearthguard or a priest. So that's how they're built. They have special abilities to kind of make that worthwhile, and depending on the army you're playing, it may or may not be, but we can get into that in the priest video sometime. But that is it. We covered some advanced rules, stuff like that. hopefully you found this useful. And that's going to cover our look at the SAGA rules from start to finish. So, we're going to cover priests separately, but if there's anything else, if you are a SAGA fan, that is, as far as a general rule, I would like to know if I missed anything, I guess. So I could go back and do another video or make an addendum or something like that. Go ahead, post that below, because I think I just about covered everything. I mean, we could get into scenarios, which is something a little different. There's priests, which I do want to do a priest video, but I think I covered like all the general kind of rules issues. I'm not getting into tactics or strategy necessarily as far as general ideas go, but just looking at the rules, I think I covered pretty much everything. So if you disagree, like I said, post below. If you got a buddy who's into SAGA, please share this video with them. Like and subscribe. Become a hobby horn dog today. SAGA!